I knew there'd be some families here that were at my talk on Sunday night, but I'm going to kind of continue the same theme today with the homeschool group, where I'm going to talk about and let's go ahead and pull up the first slide, just the amazing wonder and awe and magnificent creativity of all that God has made in creation. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to use lots of examples of how evolution could not possibly explain these things. It just completely contradicts the idea that life could have formed itself or slow gradual processes could have made life and so on. But just kind of so you know, my background, I worked for almost 30 years at the Dow Chemical Company, and I got out of college. I grew up and I loved to figure out how things worked. Like I would take apart radios and I'd take apart fans and I'd take apart stuff. And more often than not, I couldn't figure out how to put them back together. And I'd get in trouble because then whatever I'm taking apart doesn't work. But it's just kind of how you figure things out is by working with them. So I ended up going into engineering. And engineering is one of those sciences where science is the understanding of how the universe operates, how chemistry works, how mechanical things work, how energy works. And that's what we've done to be able to build and understand computers and rockets and cars and refrigerators. It's all because we understand how creation operates. And the engineers, they take those principles and they figure out how to actually turn it into something that can be used and build it in factories and make things work better. So it was just perfect, and I loved my job over those 27 years. And by the way, I left my career at Dow Chemical when I was 49 years old in order to go teach and speak and write on creation, because I've become incredibly concerned that the truth is totally left out of our public education system. And I don't know if you all realize this. This is probably the primary reason that you all are being homeschooled, is because your parents don't want God and they don't want the Bible left out of the thinking. You're thinking as you study the world around us and learn about history and learn about how the world operates. So thanks for coming this morning. I actually invented 17 different products and improvements and got patents when I was at Dow that made millions and millions of dollars for the company. So I had a very successful career and I loved doing what I was doing. But this burden to try to help people understand that honestly they're being lied to about where everything came from became stronger and stronger until I just kind of at the right time said I'm going to go do that instead of invent some new thing. So that's kind of who I am. I've written 8 books on the evidence for creation, and I just gave you one of them. And all my books are very, very colorful. They're filled with pictures, and they're not like a textbook where there's a whole chapter on a given subject. There's like one page talking about things. Because I think we need to grab people's attention fast nowadays, and not necessarily entertain them, but we at least need to be very, very visual and very, very clear in what we present. Now, I want to, for the parents, I want to talk about some of the resources on my table, just so you know. There's 3 different devotionals. 2 of them are hardcover, full color. And about, if we have time later, because we have 2 hours, and we'll take a break about 45 minutes into it and go to the bathroom and stretch. And then we'll come back and do more kind of really fun stuff about things in creation. And if I have time, I'll show some slides about God opened up the opportunity in foreign countries, especially developing nations that aren't like Europe. There's this real freedom to go talk about God in their public school systems. You can't do that in America. Because in America, for a long story, it's a whole lecture in and of itself, we decided in 1948, that's been 60 years ago, 70 years ago, that we were going to have a separation of church and state. Now, the church deals with things that deal with God. The state means the government, and the government runs the school system. So starting in 1960, the courts said, well, if we're going to separate anything dealing with God from anything dealing with the school, we can't have Bibles in our school. We can't teach anything out of the Bible in our school. We can't even mention God in our schools as a teacher and educator telling people things. We can't discuss anything except evolution as an explanation for where we came from in our public schools. And if you even show students that there's problems with evolution, and I'm just going to give you an example. There was a court case in 1985 in Georgia where the Georgia state legislature, which is lots of Bible-believing people there, they wanted to put a sticker on all the students' biology books that said, evolution is a theory, not a fact. That's all they wanted to do. They weren't even promoting that they could show some of the evidences I'm going to be showing you for creation. Just had a sticker that said, so the students would know, evolution isn't a fact. It's just somebody's idea. It's just a theory. Well, the courts, it went all the way to the Georgia Supreme Court, they said, you can't do that. You can't tell students that evolution is just a theory. Because the only alternative to evolution, and let me explain it this way, is that there's a creator. I mean, think of the entire universe as this box. Just imagine this represents everything that exists. All of the stars, all of the space, the galaxies, Earth, all the animals. Like if I open this box, you know, there's all these jewels inside the box. It's a jewelry box, but pretend those are like the elephants and the banana trees and the people and all the complex forms of life. Everything is represented by this box. There's only two possible explanations for where did this box come from. One of those explanations is that the box made itself. Okay, it made itself. I mean, you could pretend that somewhere way far back in time, there was like a rock, and another rock fell, and it just sheared it off in a straight face, and then another rock fell, and it just broke it in a straight face, and you ended up with this square form, and then lightning struck, and a crack formed in the rock. And then a cow came walking along, and he just died, and his skin just fell off and turned black, and it coated it in this black surface. And it just made itself by just random chance processes. I mean, you could pretend that's what happened to create the box. Or, if that's not true, if the box didn't make itself, what's the only other possibility for why this box exists? Well, not necessarily God, because we're talking about the box, but somebody made it. There was a box maker. You're thinking exactly right. See, there's no other possibilities. If somebody didn't make the box, it had to have made itself. So if you're going to separate church and state, if you're going to say you can't involve God, then you have to believe evolution's true. It's the only option left. So it's promoted and talked about as a fact of science because we've chosen as a culture to leave God out of our thinking. So that's what's going on. And when you put a sticker on a science book that says evolution is just a theory, the only alternative is there has been a creator. And by law, we've decided as a nation we can't do that in our public education system. So you understand how we got where we got? That's why things are the way they are. Go ahead. Quick comment.
Just because 9 people in a court make a decision, does that make it right?
Well, let me take that a step further before I answer that question. Suppose 99.99% of all scientists say evolution's true. Does that make it true? I mean, if there's huge scientific consensus, where did those scientists get their ideas? Where do all of us get our beliefs? How do you know that 1 + 1 is 2? How do you know that? Because somebody taught you that. And then somebody taught them to teach you that. So what people believe is a result of what we have been told is true. And I'm going to give you several examples of how when you're taught to think a certain way over and over and over and over again, you literally become blind to any other possibility. You can't even see the possibility something else could be true. So increasingly, the majority of people believe in evolution because they're being taught it over and over again, and they're not shown the problems with it, and they're not shown what's wrong with it. So I want to back up just a second. I want to talk about the resources, and then we'll get rolling with some of the slides and things we're going to discuss this morning. As I was saying, what led me in this side issue was about 5 years ago, I was invited to go to the Nation of Fiji. And the person who invited me, Dr. Carl Baugh, he said we're going to be able to speak at a university and then have a conference in the evenings. And we spent a week there, and it went really well, and it was great. And we were working with a missionary that his vision was to reach the whole next generation and connect the Bible with truth and reality and help them to understand it's real. Because Fiji started out as the cannibal capital of the world. I mean, they literally, 160 years ago, were eating other human beings. The man who unified all the Fiji Islands, he bragged he had eaten 990 human beings. He was proud of it. And this is really graphic, but they would raise children from other tribes so they could eat them. I mean, they were horrendously evil. And yet Christians came over and over again. They reached the man who was like bragging about eating all these people. And he realized that if God became a human being, literally was a human and died for us, how could he eat other human beings? And look at what the one who had created everything had done for us. And he changed, just like Nineveh. All those evil people, when Jonah went, they literally repented and changed. And the whole nation followed him. And there are tens of thousands of churches all over that nation. And yet, as a now very strong Christian nation, they are losing their faith and their belief with the next generation because their textbooks are just filled with this idea of evolution, and the media and the movies infiltrating this nation. And they're becoming much, much less interested in the Bible and God. Even though every student has a Bible, it's just not real to them. So I said to the missionary, if I could come, and actually the very first year, just to keep the cost low, we printed this book and gave to all those students. We gave away 30,000 of these books and went to about 40 schools. And many of these schools had 500 or 1,000 students. And they would let me come in a public school and do hour-long science assemblies where I talk about how the Bible's a book of science, not just religion, not just history. It's also filled with scientific principles, and it can be trusted, about how life is so complex it couldn't possibly have made itself. And I'm going to show you some of those demonstrations this morning. And then how the worldwide flood explained dinosaurs and the rock layers and the fossils and stuff you've already probably heard in your homeschool lessons. And then I ended with some examples of how the world can be blinded to the truth when they're only taught when God's left out of their thinking. And it had such an impact that we got permission from the Department of Education of the entire nation to go into every single high school in the whole nation. And since then, we've been in 160 high schools, and we've given away about 120,000 of these books, these hard color devotionals, okay? So these are really, really great books. And then there's a third one out there. So if you don't have one, you might want to think about it, and think about them as presents for other people. 2 other books I've written. When I left Dow, I spent 2 years, and I thought, what are the best evidences for creation that have never been refuted? And I divided it into the first third of the book's all about biology. The middle third of the book's all about the worldwide flood and geology. The last third's about radiocarbon dating and radiometric dating and the star formation and physics. So it's biology, geology, and astronomy, physics. And all the pages are like, this talks about the million woolly mammoths that were buried in Siberia. And it has a skeptic's corner about what do the skeptics and the atheists say about this evidence and how it had to have happened rapidly and recently. This talks about just a sudden appearance of very different body structures of life throughout the geological record. Or in the cosmology section, I might talk about how Einstein used to believe the universe was static and wasn't expanding until he realized he had put a fudge factor, a totally made-up constant in his equations in order to hold on to his belief. And then realized because of Hubble and others, the universe is expanding, which is exactly what the Bible had to say. So really neat book about science. And last, as I speak to Christians, they many of them understand those billions and millions of years don't fit in the Bible, but they still get sucked into this idea that, 15,000 years ago, Native Americans migrated into America, and Egypt started about 9,000 years ago, and, there was an ice age, that started a couple 100,000 and ended up 12,000 years ago, and none of that fits biblically. So I spent, again, a couple years, and I went to Peru, and I went to various countries, and I collected all sorts of information of these ancient cultures, of their brilliance. We're all been trained that there's been a Stone Age, and then man got more knowledgeable, and there was a Bronze Age, and then eventually there was the Iron Age, and now we're in the Modern Age. And all the archaeologists, whatever they find, they stick it into that pattern. It's like if they find people with all sorts of stone tools living in an ancient culture, they assume, well, those tools were being used like 20, 30, 40,000 years ago when we were in the Stone Age, because it's their framework of thinking of where to stick things. So I created a book where there's a timeline across the top, and it shows where creation happened, where the flood is, where the ice age is, and then there's all these artifacts, and it shows how they fit into a 6,000-year timeline of history. And it talks about the dating methods and how it all works. And every page is just this neat artifact like the Great Wall of China, which was literally their super highway that went from one end of their nation to the other. And over in China, they have this 10,000 caratata hollow clay figurines that's like an army to protect the emperor after he died. They believe it took 400,000 people working to make that, which is about the same number of people that working on the NASA space program to send man to the moon. And this was at the beginning of human history for a project. So it's a really neat book. A couple more. Just so you know, as I've taught for 30 years and I'm getting older, I thought, I really need to capture all this teaching and make it as a class that people can use, because I can only get to about, a couple, maybe 20 churches a year. So I hired someone right out of college, full-time, and we went around the country filming an 18-part creation video curriculum, because I didn't want to just be standing in front of a screen showing pictures. So we were in the Grand Canyon and at Mount St. Helens and at Mount Rushmore and in science museums and at the Meteor Crater and all over the United States filming these things. And it covers genetics and biology and geology and dating methods and the blindness that's going on. And it's set up as a class with breaks for questions and a leader's guide. And it's spent about $150,000 filming it with hiring someone full-time. And he did all the video editing. He added animation. There's all sorts of video clips. And it's really, really, really well done and really interesting. So if you're looking for a cool curriculum, I try to keep things so they're super affordable. I sell all 18 lessons, which is 9 videos, plus any one of the books, and it's $70. So it's kind of a neat resource. There was a researcher named Mark Armitage who worked for the University of California. He'd read a report on soft dinosaur tissue being found, so he went looking for it in Wyoming on his summer off. He ran the microscopy lab. He came back, pulled apart a Triceratops horn, found tissue so fresh, you could find sheets of it, stretch it, and it would snap right back. There were little, and I'm not going to talk about this during the lecture, which is why I wanted to bring it up now. I don't know if you can see these pictures. Those little structures are osteocytes. They're bone-making cells. The little fibrous arms you see coming off of those cells are what pull in calcium to form all the connections to form a spongy-like bone matrix. Now, those couldn't still be there, and they're soft. They'll bend and flop around. They're not turned into solid rock. They're still so fragile and so small. The structures are all still there. They couldn't be there after 60 million years in the ground. He started showing these things to students at the University of California. They were flocking to his microscope lab to see new, fresh dinosaur cells and tissue under the microscopes. Within a week, he was fired and removed from the university because he was influencing the thinking of the students to reject what they were being taught about how old everything was. He's also found clotted blood cells, blood vessels, nerve bundles. He's written 2 elementary school age books that are just fascinating for adults because of all the information and the pictures they contain of all this stuff that's inside of dinosaur bones. So those are out there, those 2 books. And everything is 10 for $70 or 3 items for $25, including these hardcolor color books. Last thing, I have 2 sets left of a Christian adventure that's just phenomenal. It's about a friend of mine wove a read-aloud story where every chapter is ending in a cliffhanger of a pre-industrial nation that's surrounded by enemies trying to destroy it. But they have this strong belief in God and in salvation by Jesus. And all the characters are either, strong biblical believing characters or those who have gone astray or enemies who reject the truth. But the hero's a little girl who, when she sings, she really visualizes she is standing in God's throne room singing to God. And she has this perfect musical ability. And she and her abilities are what changed the entire nation. And it's just such a cool story. So fun read if you're looking for just a fun Christian uplifting novel to read. It comes in 3 parts. And again, all 3 are one of the items that count as a 3 for $25. So enough of that, but I wanted you to know what the resources were that you can put to use. All right, so we're going to get started. The amazing wonder of life. All right, this is going to be a pain if I can't get these things to change. Okay. I may have to tell you to change it because I've had to push it 5 times just to get it to change once. All right, I want to start by just giving you a couple graphic illustrations to understand the wonder of life and of a living cell. Okay, so if you look at any living cell, whether it's a blood cell or a skin cell or a hair cell or an osteocyte, which is a bone building cell, there are thousands of parts. Not just a dozens, not just 100. There are thousands of specific chemicals that are inside of that cell that are all kind of lock and they build together and they work together just like the cogs in a machine or the parts of a pen. They all have to be there or you don't have the pen. Now, the first thing I want you to understand, and you won't hear this in a normal, class in a school, none of those parts occur naturally. No biologist or no biochemist who studies the chemistry of life, they could go to a beach somewhere, or they could fly to Mars, or they could fly to the moon, and they could find biochemicals. Bio is part of the word biology for something that's alive. Chemicals are the chemicals that things are made of. God used chemicals to make life in our bodies, okay? They're like the parts of a machine. But biochemicals are only made inside of living cells. And they're very, very specific. And let me show you an example. The most common chemical of life is called a protein. And a protein is a very specific kind of chemical. And it's made up of a bunch of smaller chemicals called amino acids. Now imagine amino acid is one of these beads. And every form of life, whether it's a bacteria or a banana tree, whether it's a fish, whether it's a gorilla, whatever, the cells in the parts of their body are made from 20 different colors of beads, 20 different amino acids. Not 19, not 16, not 26. It's always the same 20 amino acids, the same 20 colored beads. And these amino acids, they link up. Like here's a red one, followed by a pink one, followed by a clear one, followed by a green one, followed by a blue one, followed by a sapphire colored one. And because those little amino acids have different shapes, it causes this whole chain to bend and fold and twist in just a certain way to form a certain shape or lock into a different protein in a different way. Just like the parts of a pin are shaped so the pin will fit together in exactly a certain way to become a pin, but it's lots of parts. The parts are designed to become a pin. The proteins are designed to be a certain shape by the arrangement of the amino acids. Now let me show you, like this living cell might have 1,000 different proteins. Our bodies have about 100,000 different biochemicals, different proteins. And you couldn't find any of these just floating around in nature. They're only made inside of living life. You're following me so far? Okay. Now let me show you what one protein looks like. It's gotten packed down. It normally just comes right out. Okay, here it comes. Okay, now here's one protein. Every single color has to be in exactly the right spot. There's a disease, it's a genetic disease, which means the programming in DNA got it wrong when a child was born to their parents. A mistake happened in like the letters of a book. DNA is like a book with a bunch of letters. And one of these colors ended up in the wrong place. It's called sickle cell anemia. Now, it happens in the protein that carries oxygen in our blood. Because one of the colors is in the wrong spot, then that molecule didn't bend and fold right. The hemoglobin, which carries oxygen, now instead of forming exactly the right shape to hold a lot of oxygen, the whole molecule ended up squished flat because of one of the beads was switched and in the wrong place with another one. Now think of all these colors that have to be in exactly the right spot, and one of them ended up in the wrong spot. People born with sickle cell anemia, because their hemoglobin doesn't carry oxygen as well, 100 years ago, their average lifespan was 2 years. They would die within 2 years. Today, we can give blood transfusions, we can give lots of medicine, but their lifespan is still only 40 years. They die very, very young because of one mistake on one of the 100,000 molecules is in the wrong place. You start to get a picture of how complex life is. That's the point of this. Now, could these beads, just because you could find 20 different beads someplace, could they all end up in exactly the right order to form exactly the right shape? If you think about it, you realize it's absolutely impossible. And it's actually, you can do statistical studies. Statistics is a science because we know what's likely to happen, what's very, very unlikely to happen. And whenever something is less likely than, say, it would happen once every 10 with 50 zeros after it times, it's called an impossibility. It could never happen. It's not just unlikely, it's impossible. Well, the odds of getting, if there's 20 different colors, okay, the odds of getting the red one first to make the right molecule that has the right shape would happen once every 20 times you were blindfolded and reached in and there's 20 amino acids, and you happen to pick the red one. That would happen once every 20 times. Getting the red one followed by the white one, that means you got to pick the red one, and then blindfolded, you reach in again and you pick out of a whole bunch of different colors, and there's 20 different colors. You happen to pick the white one next. It would happen once every 20 times, or once every 400 tries. To get 3 of them right would be 20 times 20 times 20, which would be once every 8,000 tries. To get just 8 of them right would happen once about every 10 billion tries. That's 10 with 9 zeros. To get 12 of them right would be 1 with 20 zeros. To get even 50 of them right would be 1 try out of 1 every with 300 zeros after it. And that's not even a useful biological protein. To get the average protein has 200 amino acids. Some of them have 50,000 of these little beads on their chain. If you are honest and you understand what God has done when he makes even the simplest molecule of life, you understand it is the most impossible thing to ever imagine scientifically, that any of the biological molecules that are useful for life could have made themselves. It could never happen. Now, if you told students in the public school system nothing but that, they would start wondering, then where did it come from? It takes incredible intelligence to cause order to happen. But that's just the molecules. Imagine that you got all the molecules you needed for life. And we're going to pretend, because I couldn't stick something that's alive in this magic can of evolution. Whoop, hang on a second. Okay. In my magic can of evolution. So I have a pin. Now, a pin has many parts. It has a tip, which I'll throw in the can. And it has a spring. Now, you'll notice you wouldn't fly to the moon and find a spring and assume it just made itself. It's obviously designed, and it's designed for a purpose. It has an ink cartridge. It's 3 parts. It has a tube at the bottom. There's 4 parts. It has this little clicker button and a clicker mechanism. That's 5-6 parts. And it has a tube. 7 parts. Now, I have all the parts I need to make a pin. Now, nobody in science has ever explained where the parts of life come from. They can't explain where the molecules come from. And by the way, you'll see like newspaper reports sometime that scientists have come close to creating life in a laboratory, and they've gotten chemicals to come together to form protocells and things that sound like they're part of life. They cheat. They start with chemicals that are only made by life. But in millions of experiments, in thousands of universities, over 100 years, probably billions of dollars spent, every single experiment has the same result. Chemicals never come alive. And this is why. See, when you just add random energy, or you put the parts together in close proximity, and I can do this and try to rearrange the parts, do you think the pin is going to come back together? See, we kind of know it doesn't. Now, let me tell you how students are deceived, because you've got to watch out for this. In 1952, a researcher by the name of Urey and Miller, his professor, they were chemists, and they thought, if you're going to explain life, we have to explain how amino acids form. That's what these little beads. So they mixed hydrogen and ammonia and methane and water, and they put it in a cylinder, and it circulated all these gases around, and then they added a spark of energy, like bang. And that energy caused those molecules to combine and form about 6 of these amino acids when they analyzed what they found inside of the fluid at the bottom of the test tube. He had made some of these amino acids just by random chance. So since 1952, and now we're talking, now that is 70 years, not 60 years, 70 years ago, every textbook has a section in the biology book that says, in this experiment, because amino acids were formed, this demonstrates how life could have formed in the early Earth's atmosphere and on other planets, because we can show how amino acids make themselves. What are the students going to think? Wow, scientists they've shown how life could have been formed. That's what the book says. And that experiment, wow, they did. They made these little amino acids. But this is what the students aren't told. You have to have all 20 amino acids to make life, to make it a protein. He only made about 6 of them. When he made those amino acids, all life, all of these specific little things called amino acids, they're like right hand and left hand gloves. Has anybody ever tried to put your right hand into a left hand glove? Does it work? No, it doesn't fit. Every time those amino acids are made by chance, you get exactly 50% right-hand gloves and 50% left-hand gloves. And they chemically are identical. They will line up and link up and react identically. They're really, really hard to separate. But God, when he made proteins for life, he used only left-hand gloves. And there's no known way that that could ever happen to form a protein. He also formed all sorts of stuff that stops these chains from forming. He left oxygen out because you wouldn't get amino acids if you had oxygen in that cylinder. And yet, all the way down into the Earth's rock layers, we find oxidized rocks showing oxygen's always been present on this planet. So what that experiment actually shows is you could never have formed life in that way. And random energy is not going to form complexity and order. But I'm going to do an experiment. I like science. And because we're told that like explosions and sparks could form the parts of life, and then that could form life, I'm going to add a whole bunch of energy to my magic can of evolution. So I'm going to add a firecracker. Okay, here we go. I got to balance it and then light it. Okay, you guys ready for an experiment? Got all the parts of the pin are in here. Let's see if I can add enough energy to turn it into a pin. Whoa, okay, that one didn't work. Lost its bang. Okay, we'll try it again. Okay, here we go. Boom! Okay. Oh my goodness. Look what just happened. What do you think about that? I guess energy can create. You guys just laughed. Why did you laugh? Why did you laugh? Because it was ridiculous. It was so absurd to think that random energy could create something that was ordered, that you laughed at it when you saw it happen. You know it's just a silly. Now, when I do this demonstration to a big assembly of students overseas, I've got to show them there were 2 pins in the can. The parts are still here. Otherwise, they think magic just happened. But no. See, when I pulled that pin out, what I actually did was deceive you to try to get you to believe that something that's ridiculous could be true. That's what's going on all around us. The students are being deceived over and over again about what couldn't be true. Even the experiment that supposedly shows amino acids could form doesn't work because they have to lie about what they got and what the implications are. But if you leave God out, that's the best you have. Now, let me go on from here, and we'll look at just a little part of something. Okay, this, by the way, if you look at, I'm going to go backwards. Okay. If you look at this cell, this particular is a single-celled organism. It has a little hair hanging out the back of it. Now, scientists have lots of names for things. This one's called a flagellum, or they're called a cilia if it doesn't spin. But a whole bunch of these bacteria, that little hair spins. And it doesn't just spin, it can spin 20,000 times in a minute, 20,000 rotations per minute. That's faster than almost any motor people can make. Really, and it can stop in a quarter turn and reverse and spin the other direction. There's no human motor that can do what this little bacteria does. So scientists spent millions of dollars in a 10-year study to try to figure out how in the world does that little bacteria get that little hair to spin. What they found at the base of the flagellum is an electric motor. It is identical with exactly the same structures and parts as a motor that spins a fan blade. And it's got little things called stators that generate a negative charge. It's got a rotor that has a positive charge that turns on and off, and it causes it to be repelled, so it picks up speed and goes faster and faster and faster. It's all inside of shafts and support mechanisms, and it runs like an electric motor to spin that thing. It has 40 different parts, and all those parts are proteins. Okay, and you see how they're very specific shapes? So God arranged the amino acids to make specific little shapes to make the parts that make a motor at the bottom of a bacteria. And you could line up 1,000 of these motors in the width of a human hair. Think about 1,000 motors lined up in the width of one of your hairs. We can't even begin to make anything similar to this. And if any one of those parts is missing, it doesn't work. Hasn't God made it so obvious that He exists? And how can scientists be so blind? We're going to talk about that as we move on along. I want to show you a little movie of one of the most recent discoveries of a bacteria that was found at the very base. So this bacteria was found in the lowest rock layer of life. So this is supposedly one of the very earliest forms of life. Except this bacteria, each of those purple gears, and there's 7 of them, is attached to a motor. So there's 7 motors in this bacteria. And there's 21 little green gears that allow all of the motors to move all of the little hairs at exactly the same speed in the same direction. So all those 7 motors are moving the 21 gears that are moving those little hairs that then spin in the same direction and allow this bacteria to move around and look for food. And if it senses food, it'll go in a certain direction. And if it senses food somewhere else, it'll stop them and reverse itself. And it can move all the way around where it wants to go based on those motors and those gears. Isn't that stunning? All those perfectly formed gears inside of a little bacteria. That's the kind of stuff we're discovering. And not after millions of years of evolution, but at the very beginning of creation. Actually, the stuff buried very first during Noah's flood. Those bacteria were created at the same time mankind was created in the early days of creation. They just got buried first during Noah's flood. Okay. So, let's look at DNA. Did I skip a slide? No, I skipped a slide. DNA is like a book, but it's not just a book. It's like a whole library of books. And it carries all the information needed to make all those molecules that make the parts, that make the cells, that work together to form our bodies. Now, the book that God wrote, it wasn't just your clicker, it's just the system. Normal books, the book I gave you, you'll start at the top of a page and you'll read to the right and then go down the next line and read down the page to the bottom and then go up to the top of the next page and you'll get information. Because the letters form words, the words have been assigned a meaning, and you've been told as you learn to read what the words mean. So we can transfer information from one person to the next based on meaning being assigned to a symbol. That's all DNA is. It's 4 chemicals that are lined up to form meanings that form the chemicals that have functions. It's a language. Except the language God wrote, it can not only be read forwards to create a word with a meaning or a chemical that has a meaning, it can then be read backwards to create a completely different chemical with a completely different useful functional meaning. It's just like this. There's a word that has a certain meaning forward. Okay? Does it mean the same thing backwards? No. It means something completely different. But they both have functional, useful, purposeful meanings. Here's another example. Desserts. Everybody loves dessert. Has a certain meaning forward. Does it have the same meaning backwards? Anybody know what that says backwards? Stressed. Very good. Stressed. Completely different meaning. See, that's what DNA does. Except it doesn't just do it with single words. It does it with entire chapters. Now think about this. Think about if you're an engineer and you happen to work for Apple and you're assigned to design the manual of how to assemble an iPhone so that people in the factory can know how to put it together correctly. And they got to read the book and follow the directions in order to make the cell phone. And you finish the manual and you walk into your boss's office and you say, I've finished it. We can now go have the factory workers assemble the iPhone. And he says, you know what? We want to save some money. So I want you to go back and I want you to rewrite the manual, except this time when you read the manual forward, starting at the first letter on the first page, it tells people how to assemble the cell phone. But when you read it backwards, starting with the last letter on the last page and reading backwards, it tells people how to use the cell phone. Same letters on the same pages. What do you think you would say to your boss? No? How about I quit? There's no supercomputer in the world that could even begin to create such a book. And yet that's God has done with the DNA code. It makes totally different chemicals, useful functioning information backwards. But that's not all we found out about DNA. It has overlapping information. Remember, its function is to transfer information to the cell so the cell can gather chemicals to make other chemicals so the cell will function. So it's transferring information. Well, let's suppose there's a section of letters in the DNA, and it just has this meaning. I'm going to use words instead of chemicals, but it has a meaning. I like chocolatier that evening. Does that make sense? Looks like I made a mistake, doesn't it? There's an extra letter. That's not a mistake. You see, what I've done, I wanted to convey two different messages, and I wanted to compact the information into a shorter space. So the first part of that information says, I like, did that show up? Yeah. I like, back up. The screen in the back is so dark that I can't see what it actually says. I like chocolate. That's the first message. It's going to make a chemical that has a function to tell the cell I like chocolate. But then, if I select those sets of letters, it says later that evening. I've conveyed two different messages in the same set of letters by overlapping the letters. I've compacted the information. I've overlapped those set of letters, so I took up less space. DNA has spliced information. Same sentence, but suppose now I just select the ones that are underlined in yellow. It says, I like her hat. Now, scientists have no clue. How does a cell know which, not in sequence, but which just completely seemingly random parts of the DNA code to select in order to create a certain molecule? Total mystery to scientists. But somehow the cell is programmed to know this, and it makes the right cell. And then there's spliced in information. There's embedded information, which means the information is just placed inside of a completely different part of it. Encrypted information, meaning one letter actually means another letter, so you can make two different molecules from the same area. And how the DNA molecule is folded and bends back upon itself in a three-dimensional structure allows information to be transferred. There is nothing in the universe, even imagined by mankind, that compacts so much information into such a small space as the DNA molecule. It gives you a little picture of the genius of God. We can't even begin to touch what he's done even in his one molecule of life. And then there's just the magnitude of it all. And then I'm going to go on to some really cool animal illustrations. If you took all of the DNA from our bodies, okay, out of every cell, we have 100 trillion cells in every human body. We start out as one cell. When a female sperm and egg come together to form a living human being in a woman, it is one cell. And that cell knows how to divide, and at a certain point, the division, they start to turn into bone cells and heart cells and brain cells and skin cells and all the different differentiation. But every cell has all the information needed to reproduce the entire human body in the nucleus, in that DNA. If we could gather up all that DNA, it would be about that much, the amount of sugar I just poured out into this teaspoon. Now, how much information is in that DNA? Well, let me illustrate, and there's nothing here on Earth that I think gives an adequate illustration. Let me illustrate it with the idea of books stacked up. You would have to have a stack of books from the surface of the Earth all the way to the moon 500 times in order to have the same amount of information that is in a single human body, a single teaspoon that's in our bodies. Now, most people think, because you see these in textbooks, you think of the Earth, and by the way, this has all the continents on it. This is the size of the Earth, a model of the Earth, and here's the moon. You'd think the moon sits about right here. Now, think of a stack of books all the way from the surface of the Earth to the moon. But the moon's 250,000 miles away. In reality, this is how far away the moon is from the Earth. I didn't realize that till someone showed me this, and I saw this on a video. That far away. Think how big the Earth is. Think how big just Indianapolis is, and Indiana, and America. A stack of books from the surface of the Earth 500 times all the way to the moon. That's how much information is in just the DNA in one of our bodies. Isn't God astounding? Just amazing. And he's packed all that in, and yet evolution says it just happened. All that information just happened by randomly changing letters in some original, simple, single-celled little book and created all the information needed to create a human being. Couldn't happen. Absolute impossibility. All right. So now we're going to look at God's creation instead of what's God's creation, how the parts of creation, how complex they are. And I have lots and lots and lots of these. So we're going to go for probably the next 10 minutes, and then we're going to take a break, and then we're going to come back and just look at some other creatures. But all of the creatures, all of the animals, all the plants, they have characteristics that prove evolution couldn't have been true. It couldn't have made itself. Now, one of those is the ability of animals to use their characteristics to disguise themselves or to protect themselves. And God built all of this in because when he made Adam and Eve, he made a perfect creation with no death, but he knew we would sin. You see, God made time. It's part of creation. So God is outside of time. He knows everything that's going to happen to every one of us. And he knew Adam and Eve would sin, so he built the ability for everything to survive, even in a sinful, death-filled world. Let's look at a few of those, because they're kind of interesting. So I don't know if there's a pause or if it's just not getting the signal. And we're going to start with kind of this beautiful moth. Now, this is the biggest moth in the world. It's called the Atlas moth, because Atlas was this ancient Greek hero that supposedly held up the earth, great big guy holding up the earth. That's a human hand behind the moth. So look how big that moth is. It is humongous, okay? It's as big as a bird. Anybody see anything interesting about that moth other than how pretty it is? Yes. You noticed that, didn't you? Most students don't, very observant. Most students don't notice that. Let me show you a clearer picture of that. When it folds its wings, check it out when it folds its wings. Look at that. Now here's this bird, okay, coming to get a moth, because birds like to swoop down and eat moths, but they don't like running around on the ground in jungles where there happen to be cobras, because cobras like to eat birds, and birds know that cobras like to eat birds. So if they see a cobra, they don't want to come anywhere near it. So check out what these wings of this bird looks like when it's standing there getting something to eat in a flower. Not just one cobra, there's two cobras. You think a bird's going to swoop down and eat it? Now, how does that happen? By randomly changing the DNA structure, information, the book inside of that moth. You know, it would never. How does it even know? How does the moth know it needs to look like a cobra? How does it know if it makes its wings look like a cobra, it's going to be protected? How does it randomly change the information to start looking like a cobra? Nobody could explain this by a random step-at-a-change process. It's like God put all these things out there for our wonder and amazement and our assurance that he's the one who did it all. Because we have, as I said last night, my whole talk was on how do we deal with our problems in life? You know, when we're sick and when people die that we love and when there's illnesses and when we have problems with coworkers and all the nasty stuff in life, we keep our focus on knowing God knows it too. And how do we know that? Because there's no other explanation for where everything came from. Don't lose that wonder of the beauty and the things God has made. This is one of my favorites, the horned toad, okay? Now, horny toads, they live out in Arizona and Nevada and in desert regions of the United States, and they're kind of cool looking. They got all these neat looking horns, and they love to eat ants. Here's a guy sticking out his tongue, getting ready to grab an ant, and some photographer got that because it happened so fast you can't even see the tongue. But guess what likes to eat them? Owls like to eat them. Coyotes like to eat them. Snakes like to eat them. And all these guys are really, really good predators. And the horny toad doesn't move all that fast. So what's the horny toad going to do? He has a whole bunch of defense mechanisms. And a lot of them make sense. He'll freeze and blend in. You see him up there in the picture to the left? Look real close. There he is. He just kind of blends in, and his skin's made to kind of camouflage itself, and he hardly shows up. But that lots of times that won't work. So then he'll run and stop and run and stop. And he's trying to confuse his predator. Well, that probably doesn't work all that well. So then he'll dig himself into the sand and try to blend in. And if that doesn't work, he blows himself up to like twice his size. So like he looks kind of threatening. Well, not to a coyote, so that probably doesn't work that well either. But then he does what no other animal in the entire world can do. There's no ancestor to this. He shoots blood out of his eyeball. So here comes the coyote with his mouth open, and he gets a nasty tasting mouthful. And for this toad's blood doesn't taste good either. Or into the snake's mouth, or into the bird's face. Shoots blood out. He can aim it and shoot it up to 4 feet away. A stream of blood right out of his eyeball. Now imagine, oh, hey, there's this big bully's after me. I know what I'll do. I'll stick a needle in my eye and shoot blood at him. It's only going to work once, and it's not going to work very well, is it? See, there are thousands of changes that had to happen in the programming of this toad in order to allow it to shoot a stream of blood out of its eyeball to protect itself. And it can do it repeatedly and accurately. Isn't that kind of cool? The kind of things God has created is just stunning. And this should be our response. Thou art worthy, O Lord, to receive glory and honor and power, for you have created all things. For thy pleasure they were created, to show his creativity and to remove any doubt that God exists. That's what it needs to do in us. Okay, now here's just kind of an ugly creature. I showed you some kind of a beautiful moth and then a really cool reptile. Here's a sea cucumber. Now, I like to scuba dive, and I've seen a lot of these, and they really are ugly. And you pick them up, and they're just like, ugh, you can squeeze them, and they're just like goo in your hand. I mean, if you like slime, I guess you'd like them. Worst thing I've ever tasted in my life. One of my business trips, I had to go to Japan, and they gave us a big banquet to honor us as we're coming to present one of my inventions, which was an insulation for refrigerators that they built over there. And first they brought, they'll eat anything, by the way, in China and Japan. Anything that moves, they'll eat it. And they don't even wait for it to stop moving. They brought a lobster, and I think lobster's kind of cool, and they set it down on the table, and they had put like gold flakes all over it, so you were actually going to eat gold while you were eating the lobster. And I looked, and then I looked again, and its tentacles were still moving on the lobster. They'd only boiled it enough that they hadn't somehow killed its brain completely, and the thing was still moving on the table. But that wasn't the worst. The worst thing was when they brought the sushi, and one of the sushis was sea cucumber. Oh, I've never in my life had to fight gagging and throwing up so much as to eat one of these critters. Nasty tasting. But the sea cucumber also doesn't like to be eaten. And it has this really, really cool defense mechanism. I mean, this thing doesn't have a lot of ways to defend itself. It doesn't move fast. It's really big and bright. So when a fish that doesn't mind that nasty taste comes down to eat it, the sea cucumber literally spews out its stomach and its intestines. It just opens up one end and shoots out all the things that are inside of it that it uses to digest food. This is what it looks like. See all that stuff that just came out of the sea cucumber? That's its stomach and its intestines. And they're really sticky, and the fish is getting ready to bite it, and it gets this mouthful of like this sticky, gooey cotton candy kind of stuff, and then it leaves. And then the sea cucumber regrows its stomach and its intestines. Kind of like, wow, what a creative way to defend yourself. You spew out your insides, and then you regrow them in order to not get eaten. Kind of cool, kind of cool. We'll do a couple of these, then we're going to take a break. Okay, now here's where I want to take just a little bit of time and logically help you guys think about, could there be little changes that allowed one animal to slowly turn into another, because that's what's going on that convinces the world that you don't have to trust the Bible. You see, every time a baby is born, or a little frog is born, or a bacteria has another bacteria, their book of DNA that's full of information, the little letter changes happen. Little random words get rearranged. They're called mutations, and they're a fact of science. And that means you're a little bit different than your parents. You have random changes, and your parents had more random changes than their parents. So with every generation, there's more and more random rearrangements of the letters in the book. And occasionally, some of those rearrangements, some of those mutations have a useful function. So you might have some ability your parents didn't have, but you haven't added more information. You just rearranged the information. But students are shown these things. But let's look at the leafhopper. The leafhopper is like a little grasshopper, and its back legs are designed for jumping. Like these long back legs, they're like this lever that propels it forward. I like to call it the gold medal Olympic athlete winner of the Olympic insect world on steroids, because it can jump so fast. When it takes off, it accelerates 100 times faster than gravity can pull something to the ground, 100 G-forces. Now, to understand that, I want to show you what just 10 times the acceleration of gravity looks like. Because when astronauts train to get in a rocket and shoot and escape the Earth's gravity field, they have to move really, really fast. And there's a lot of force push. The faster you move, if you've ever been in the car that accelerates around the corner, you can feel it kind of pushing you that direction. When you reach 10 Gs, 10 times the acceleration of gravity, the blood is being drained from your head and you're in danger of blacking out. So they put them in these centrifuges that spin them around and around to see, can you take a lot of speed? And they test their ability to handle lots of speed. This is what 10 times the acceleration of gravity looks like. These girls are moving so fast, their faces are being pushed backwards. Okay, that's 10 G-forces. This little insect takes off at 100 G-forces. Now, that's like a bullet coming out of a gun. He literally disappears, he jumps so fast. The little nymph, the little baby insect jumps that fast. And scientists were wondering, how can it move that fast? Because here's the problem. The little leafhopper's walking in the jungle. Okay, he's just walking along, dum-de-dum-dum-dum-dum-dum, and his brain says, jump. So when you think, move my hand, a signal has to come down from your brain, it has to go through your back, it has to go down your arm, and it has to tell your hand to move. And we know how fast nerve signals move. It's not like the speed of light. It's hundreds of miles per hour. So when the leafhopper says jump, that signal has to go down his back, go to his legs, it has to split, it has to go to his right leg, and it has to go to his left leg, and then both legs have to spring forward, and the muscles or the little proteins that contract have to move. Well, we know how fast that nerve signal is moving, and we know how fast that little muscle has to contract in order to move him forward at 100 G-forces, like the speed of a bullet. And that signal that says jump, it's guaranteed to reach one of those muscles faster than the other. And they respond so fast, one of those legs is going to shove before the other leg shoves. Now think about this. If I'm standing here and I say jump, and that signal reaches my right leg first, and I go to jump, am I going to go in a straight line if I just push first with my right leg? Or am I going to go sideways? Think about it. Now, if I jump on both at the same time, I go forward. But if I just jump with one leg, I'm going to go straight sideways. At the speed of a bullet, I'm going to hit the tree instead of jumping forward. My little brain's going to fly open because that's really fast. And I'm going to die. But this insect doesn't go sideways. So this is really confusing to scientists. How does this insect keep both legs moving at the same time when it shouldn't be able to do that? So they studied it, and they studied it. And they went to electron microscopes, and what they discovered deep down inside of this little insect, hang on a second, are 2, remember those bacteria with those little gears? I mean, this is astounding. God created a program that makes these little chains, just these little proteins, to bend and fold and twist so they form the perfect shape of 2 perfect gears. And those gears are attached to the legs, so that if one leg starts to move, it forces both legs to move in perfect unison. I mean, you should be astounded when we see stuff like this. I think that's the response God would expect us to have. An absolute wonder that under a microscope, there's little gears. Now think about what the whole world is being told. Little tiny changes turned some insect that didn't have those gears into an insect that did have those gears, because those gears are really, really useful. Could that be true? Well, this is what God expects of each one of you as you go to college and you go through school and people tell you things. Is it possible? Is it true? God cares about truth. Could little changes to something that doesn't have a gear turn it into a gear? Suppose I have an insect that doesn't have a gear. I mean, that gear just appeared, that's creation. That means somebody created it. Nobody in our education system is allowed to think that way. They have to believe it formed itself. So you have to start with something that's not a gear. A mutation, let's say this insect just had a little round thing. It's not a gear yet. A mutation's like a mistake. It's like taking something that's not a gear and hitting it with a hammer. I can hit it with a hammer again. And I can hit it with a hammer again. I can hit it with mutation. Guess what? I'm going to start to form little fins, little chips. Well, okay. Is that going to be useful to the insect that doesn't have a gear? Well, if I have a round thing over here and I have another thing over here and it's got just a fin sticking out, guess what? It's not going to move. Those legs are going to get stuck. The insect's going to die. Suppose I start to get lots of little fins on this hand, but there's nothing over here. Every time the leg moves, it's just going to dig and grind into the other leg. The insect's going to die. Suppose I have fins that are just straight across. They aren't going to rotate. They're going to get stuck. Suppose I only have 3 here, but I have 4 there. It's not going to move the right direction. And then I've got to have a muscle attached to the gear that pulls the gear forward. And I've got to have a signal that goes from the muscle to the brain. And the brain's got to know what to do with the signal. And the gear is a right-hand gear and a left-hand gear. They're not even the same shape. And they have to lock into each other and move forward. You see, unless everything is there, and everything is the perfect shape, and all the parts are there, and the instincts are there, and the signals are there, and the nerve is there, nothing works. And you have an insect that can't survive because it's got this tumor inside of it that doesn't even help its legs move. It is so obvious that something as simple as that could never make itself in one little change at a time. And yet, someone who's a PhD biologist, he'll look at that and he'll say, wow, look what evolution has created. He'll just throw the word evolution at it. It's useful. The animal that has those gears has an advantage over an animal that doesn't have them, so evolution must have created it. But he doesn't think, how could it happen one step at a time? It couldn't. And it's just, he's blind to it. Now, professors, when you get into college, and museums when you go to them, and books that you read, and movies you hear that talk about evolution, they're not written by stupid people. And they're not written by the people who are necessarily out to deceive you. It's just the people who are promoting it have only been thought to think in a way that leaves the Bible and leaves God out of their thinking. And just remember that as you're exposed to all this stuff that contradicts the Bible. Doesn't mean what's being said is true. It means that it's been left out of their thinking. So right before I end this section,
we're done.
I want to show this little video that illustrates that fact, okay? Now, this is a little 3-minute movie that was made back in 1955. So it's ancient. But there's a scientist trying to discover how does our brain work in order to see an image. I want you to watch this. It's really interesting, but it's very, very profound, and I'll talk about it before we take a break.
If seeing were done only in the eye, everything would be upside down to us. Just as in a camera, the lens of the eye forms the image upside down. The image is then inverted by the brain so that it appears right side up. Now, what would happen if a lens system were used to form the image right side up? Well, the brain would immediately invert the image so that it would be upside down. But would this condition be permanent? To answer this question, we asked Mr. Gratz, our optical expert, to design for us a pair of inverting spectacles. While the spectacles were being constructed in our shop, we faced the problem of who was going to wear the things continuously for several weeks. You'll want to meet our unlucky winner. That's right, me. Even from the first, it was possible to walk in this topsy-turvy fashion, but it didn't take long to develop a rollicking case of seasickness. We decided that for your sake as well as ours, we'd better conduct our first test sitting down. However, just sitting down wasn't so easy. Even the simplest tasks were at first impossible. No amount of concentration or effort could overcome the compulsion to reach in the wrong direction. The inverting spectacles had to be worn every waking moment during the entire period of the experiment. Anytime the glasses were removed, the eyes were closed or fully covered. Walking to work upside down was an exhausting experience, but it provided a valuable period of relearning and reorientation. It also caused quite a stir in the neighborhood. Gradually, it became easier to get around in this upside-down world. By a slow and painful process, the image in the brain had been erected.
When you're looking at me, you see an image of me standing upside down, but in the back of your eyeball, that image is upside down. So everything you're looking at is actually being seen upside down by your brain, but your brain flips it right side up, and you don't even know it's doing it. You can't stop your brain from doing that. You're seeing everything right side up, even though the image is upside down. So every day, he's wearing these glasses that flips it the right way. So in the back of his eye, things are right side up, or the brain just flips it upside down. And he wears them day after day for about 2 weeks. And it wasn't like after 1 week, things are now 45 degrees, and after 10 days, things are starting to rotate, so they're now part right side up. He just wakes up one day, opens his eyes with the glasses on, and things are now right side up. Now, what's going on? His brain has been trained from birth that that image should be right side up. So his brain knows to turn the image right side up. But then he puts on these glasses, and his brain's getting in information, and it says, it's the opposite of what I know to be true. What I see is the opposite of what I know to be true. But the information just keeps coming. It's 180 degrees wrong. It's 180 degrees wrong. It's the opposite. But finally, the human brain decides, what I used to believe that was 180 degrees wrong, completely the opposite of the truth, it must be the truth. So now I'm going to make what I used to believe to be not the truth, I'm going to make that the truth. And it flipped the image right side up. That's what the human brain is capable of. When you take children and you teach them a lie over and over and over and over again, it locks a framework of what is true into the brain. And when something comes in that just is the opposite of that, the brain can't even acknowledge it. It won't even begin to consider the possibility that could be true. That's what's going on all around us. The truth is being left out of the thinking of entire generations of students. I mean, haven't you ever tried to tell somebody something and you've shown them why it's true and they can't even seem to begin to get it? It's because they've been trained to think in a different way. See, that's how God built our brains. Now, I used to think, well, people are deceived because we're fallen human beings and we can't reason correctly. But I came to realize, no, God built the human brain this way so that we wouldn't have to rethink everything that came in to think, well, is that true, and reanalyze it and rethink about it. Once we form a pattern of what is true, we don't have to rethink about it again. We just immediately know it's true. You know what God did? That's part of freedom, to choose truth over to choose a lie. To choose a lie, we have to be able to be deceived by a lie, or it's not a choice. We're just programmed to always know the truth. He had to give us that choice. And then he warns us over and over and over again, make my word the light unto your feet and the light unto your path, the lamp unto your path. He says, do not be conformed by the thinking of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Over and over again, God warns us to make his word the foundation of truth, because otherwise we slowly, don't even realize it, start to believe what's not the truth is the truth, and we don't even realize we're doing it, just like he didn't realize that. Now, every one of those Rocks Cry Out videos ends with one of these. This one is on the very first lesson, and it's a longer version of it, of how the world around us can be so blind. Because if your children don't understand that, it's much easier for them to get sucked into it. But once you realize people aren't necessarily out to deceive you, they themselves have just been deceived to the point where they can't even see the truth. It's much easier to understand why they're telling you what they're telling you. So, okay, with that, let's take a break, stretch, get a drink, go to the bathroom if you need to, but let's come back in 5 minutes and I'll wrap up in the next half hour.